What is life, really? I promise to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that regardless of your expertise and experience in the field of biology and natural history, your understanding of life is on the whole misrepresented and incomplete. Whatever you know is post-event, meaning that Darwinian evolution and most of the experts and natural historians take the story of life, in my opinion, halfway through say a movie. The full story lies ahead of it, which they have not looked at yet, and that's the quantum foundations of life and evolution, if there is such a thing. If there is, then you can see that they've missed it, because I think it becomes misrepresented if you don't see the full picture, and it obviously is incomplete. Whatever you think you know is post the event. In other words, it's halfway across. It's too late to see the full picture, and they could be misrepresented. These are pretty arrogant statements, are they not? Well, let me try, because until you see the evidence, maybe I may have a point. These videos in a series are numbered as such, so please try and follow them if you're interested, or if you become interested to see the fuller picture. They represent, if you like, the movie of evolution in steps, but every one should be, if I've got it right, self-sufficient enough to provide a reasonable explanation for the subject matter that it defines. And hopefully it might then entice you to look at the other one so you can get a fuller picture. In my view, it is not possible to understand what life is if you do not fully understand what gravity is first. Now that may seem pretty crazy, but that was my point. So if you don't understand what gravity is, then it's difficult for you to really appreciate what life is. And why? Because if any discipline in science, no matter what it is, if it's genetics, if it's psychology, if it's human biology, natural history, etc., if it is not firmly anchored in physics and the laws of physics, then it's probably wrong. It's probably just a lucky guess at best. Why? Because the laws of physics determines the logical path of evolution. And that's, I think, very important. So I'll try and explain what I mean by that. But it is the laws of physics that define a logical path, because if there were no laws, there would be no logical path. Things would be doing whatever the hell they wanted. How could you define an algorithm? How could you define a sequence if there weren't laws that made that possible? So what is that? When we say anything is possible, well, it's not. That's some stupid crap that we tell in motivational videos on Instagram, or we tell our kids. I don't know what point it is that we're making, I guess, to motivate them, but it's not true at all. It's nonsense. At the irresistible stage, please try and remember this word, and you will see as we define it, because it is actually very important in evolution that we distinguish irresistible from conscious. The irresistible stages of evolution, obviously choices are made and selections are made, but these are made entirely on the principle of irresistibility, meaning chemical pathways. So events happen because they must, and they do not happen because they cannot. That's very important, because not everything is possible. So as we'll see in a minute. So what can happen and what cannot happen is determined by the laws of physics. Let's see. Here are a few examples of the irresistible selection and propagation. You must be able to think of thousands more, and we will see, as we discuss, that in the subsequent videos, the story of evolution, many more. But here's a couple of examples so you see what I'm trying to say. H2 plus O2, hydrogen, oxygen, gives water, not hydrochloric acid or ammonia or anything else for that matter. Those are not possible. Only that is possible. In your DNA, adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine pairing, no other base pairing will do, and no other bases will do, because that is how things have evolved. The Earth orbits around the Sun, not Jupiter. You can't change it, no matter what you want to, or how much you think or pray. That is how it is. There are many more examples. You can probably think of more yourself. So, what is gravity? First of all, where does it really come from? Physicists don't know it. If you want to see the full justification of what I'm about to say, please see the relevant earlier videos where I try to explain it, and hopefully you'll see that I may have a point. But here's a brief summary. if you asked me to describe this entire universe in a single word, not the meaning of the universe, and that would be completely stupid, how would I know? But if a single word could be used to define and explain this universe, what would it be? I would use the word hydrogen to describe this entire universe. Why? Because everything in it is either hydrogen or made up by hydrogen, including the laws of physics. It themselves are made up from this congregation right here, from a proton and electron. Why? Let's see. All atoms are rearrangements of hydrogen atoms. Please take a moment and look at this. You may have seen it before if you follow the video. If not, then I would suggest you take a few minutes to see if you agree with me. If not, then there's no point in you reading looking at the videos or any other ones, because this is the foundation of what I'm trying to say. Here we have an electron and a proton. 4 of these make a helium. There are 4 protons, by the way. I don't call them neutrons because the part of the 2 electrons that are missing here, because there would be 4 electrons, is covalently bonding these protons together. Why it would choose one proton, not the other, makes no sense. So when they're in the nucleus, they are bonded together, and that's how they must share the electrons equally between these 4 protons. When you break the nucleus, if neutrons come up separately and protons come up separately, I don't believe that's possible either, but I haven't done the experiment, so I wouldn't know. Let's assume that the physicists are right and there is such a thing as a neutron and a proton separately, then the electrons must then go with one of the protons. But essentially a neutron, as the point I'm making here, is just a proton that has been modified. Here's oxygen. You have 16 of them here, so 16 protons there in the center. Obviously neutrons again are modified protons or bonded together, and you have the electrons around the outside. So proton on the inside, proton on the inside, proton on the inside. Here's sodium, protons on the inside, electrons on the outside. Just a bigger and bigger hydrogen atom, essentially. Why not? We can just look at it. It's just the same principle, but just getting bigger. Since a rock is made up of atoms, these atoms and other atoms in the periodic table, and compounds made from these atoms, then a rock is nothing but a congregation of hydrogen atoms, in effect, because if you look at it in terms of its gravitational field and gravitational interaction, the rock itself is just a big hydrogen atom. So is the moon, so is the sun, so is the Milky Way and the black star in it, and everything that it contains. They are just bigger hydrogen atoms because they are all have centers that are protons and electrons around them. In this particular case, it becomes a relative relationship, as you'll see in a minute. So why gravity squashes? If we begin with just 2 hydrogen atoms separate, I've put them in here as trapeze artists dangling from the ceiling. If they were to grab each other's hands and pull, what would happen? Well, obviously they're going to get squashed together. These are 2 hydrogen atoms pulling on each other's electrons, and this is why it squashes. Now, no matter how many other hydrogen atoms you have in this congregation that keeps coming in, and they will keep coming in because nothing has changed, if that is the more stable version and the atoms are not, then once this is formed, the ratio between the electron and the proton does not change. They're still the same, and therefore the hunger remains the same. So why wouldn't more of them congregate? And the answer is they do. That's where gravity comes from. It is an internal force. All bonding is gravity. It's just relative gravity. So basically, the more you have, the more this cluster grows, and all of the vector forces of essentially what starts as pulling will all be directed towards the center. And what you end up with is what I call lattice pressure. And lattice pressure is all of these vector forces directed towards the middle, which gives rise again to the principle I was just describing to you. If you look at a proton, the most simple way to describe a proton, forget about the quarks and all the other nonsense which are mathematical garbage, but if you look at it, the most sensible thing to view an a proton is a force field. That's all. It is strongest in the middle, and it just gets weaker as it goes out until at a certain distance it vanishes. Now, if you keep adding more and more and more, that particular force field just gets bigger and bigger. So every proton, but remember neutrons are just modified protons, that you add to the cluster as the nebula condenses becomes a bigger and bigger proton. So relatively speaking then, we have all the vector forces are additive. These are the neutrons giving rise to a bigger vector forces, and relative to one another, depending on the proton content, one becomes the electron, if you like, around, and that's why you get this orbiting. So if you have a rock, it will orbit the moon because the moon is proton rich relative to that, and this thing, the little rock, is electron rich relative to that, and therefore it tries to do exactly what the hydrogen proton was trying to do in the first place, suck out the electrons. Now here we have the Earth relative to the moon, and it's doing the same. Okay, it happens the other way around as well, because it tries to suck, the protons here also try to suck out the electrons here. But on the whole, because this is more powerful, because it's a bigger mass, more protons, it acts as a net proton field relative to this, and the Sun and the Earth relationship is identical, which is what you should expect it to be, because they're all made up of the same things. If you accept that makes some sense, what I just told you, like I said, for fuller explanation you're going to have to see the other videos in the series ahead of it, but if it does make some sense, then that was the mechanism of gravity and where it comes from. But what is the motive of gravity? This is very important, because this will become vital when we look at evolution, and especially later in moral philosophy, because the motive of gravity is extremely important. From the very first step, the motive of gravity is obvious. It should be very obvious. If you look at it, it is like a vacuum cleaner made by itself, so that when the first two hydrogen atoms combine, it provides a center, and then all the other ones keep combining, so it's sucking all the other ones from the nebula. If there was in fact single atoms, that wouldn't be the case, but anyway, just for the sake of this example, it essentially becomes a self-made Hoover that just keeps sucking more and more hydrogen atoms. So it's a self-made Hoover for that purpose, because the whole congregation begins from the atoms going to the molecule, and then a bigger molecule, and on and on and on. So the sequence of primary reactions in the universe, at the very beginning, if you like, is a hydrogen atom that preferentially wants to be a hydrogen molecule, and then all of the hydrogen nebulae around it condenses, so it becomes hydrogen moon and planet, and then hydrogen star. This is where things get complicated. This is where the fundamental motive of gravity breaks apart, and something else happens, because fusion occurs. And fusion is what I would call the alienated step in gravity, because it's a mistake. Gravity, all it wants to do is just keep congregating atoms, especially at the beginning hydrogen atoms, and later just any atom, because they all remember hydrogen atoms anyway. So, but this is the problem, because something then happens, because the lattice pressure, like I described before, increases, and it becomes critical, and after that fusion occurs. And when fusion occurs from these hydrogen atoms, one electron, one proton, we get photons. So all the electromagnetic spectrum is manufactured by fusion, and neutrons are manufactured. Therefore it is wrong to believe that photons and neutrons are fundamental particles. They're not. The fundamental particle is electron and proton, and even from here you should be able to see that these two must be the same or very, very similar, and electrons and photons must be very, very similar. In fact, electrons and photons are identical. You're going to have to see the early videos. The only difference is that photons are the free versions and electrons are trapped versions when they're in the vicinity of other protons or in the vicinity of other atoms and molecules, because their electrons are also of the same wavelength, and therefore the same wavelengths interact, and you get this idea of the electronic mass, which is not real mass, it's induced mass, but it's a separate video. So something goes wrong with the motive of gravity, and like I said, can you guess what it is? Well, I've given you the answer. So the motive becomes alienated. Why you're called alienated? Because it's a mistake. It was never meant to be this. The whole idea was that everything that was a hydrogen atoms that were available should be just squashed together, and that's it. Instead of a pile of compressed hydrogen atoms, a new entity is born. Something else happens, and you'll see why that alienation is the right process. So the process of fusion, and the outcome is speciation. Atomic speciation. I call it speciation, and I call it in the cosmic Serengeti for a very good reason, because the relationship between the atoms is exactly the same as the relationship between any animal in the real Serengeti in Kenya. And it's the electronic slope food chain, as you'll see what I mean by that later. And you should expect that to be the case, because all of the atoms, including you and me, we're made out of exactly the same thing, essentially the hydrogen atom, which then becomes other atoms and then becomes compounds and it becomes us. So why should they be any different? Now, I know physics says there's magic and mystery, but that's not really true. They just like to make things difficult, because I guess simple doesn't win Nobel Prizes. But anyway, you're going to have to make up your own mind and read see those videos. But in this particular case, speciation or atomic speciation from fusion is the right word here, because their relationship is exactly the same. So life, therefore, is a process, and it begins right here from speciation of atoms. Simply because, think about it, no atom, no life. How can you have life? So the process of life begins from this alienated step, which is fusion and the speciation of atoms, and then, of course, we get a molecular speciation, and on it goes. Just to recap again, but here I'll try to show you what I mean, so you can very clearly see the difference between gravity and alienated gravity. Is that here we have the hydrogen atom. If we had 4 of those and they were congregated gravitationally, what would be the population number? Well, it would be 4, obviously, because there are 4 hydrogen atoms. However, we've taken 4 hydrogen atoms and we now have helium. What is the population number of this congregation? Well, the answer is 1. It's a single helium atom. Although it's made up of 4 hydrogens, it is no longer 4 hydrogens. It is a totally different thing. Here we have a congregation of 16 of them. But what is the total population number? Well, the answer is 1, because it's a single oxygen atom. On and on it goes. Every single atom is a different species, if you like. And the congregation, although it's made up of hydrogen atoms, because it's now congregated through alienation or alienated gravity, its sum is 1. And this is the most important thing that you have to remember. Throughout evolution, you will see this exact same principle, that if in any congregation you can add the numbers, then that congregation is gravitational. You should never be able to add them in the real congregation that has been evolving through alienation, because that sum should always be 1. In other words, any life form that you can take on planet Earth and you look at its history, you will see that it's just nothing but congregation, layering of alienation, and its sum is always 1. This is here, of course, it doesn't really mean anything, because whatever you have, the sum does not apply, because they're purely gravitational. So although relative to one another they act as a kind of proton center and electron center, but in reality these are pure gravitational congregations, and that's not the same thing here. You can add the atoms in these if you wanted to, trillions of them, or compounds or whatever. It would mean nothing. But here, the path of alienation, the sum is always 1. If you need a full explanation of the points raised here and in the subsequent videos, then please get this book. It's number 2 in the series, and it's called Bionomy. It's free as a Kindle ebook. I don't want anything from you. My motivation, I'm not on any media, I don't subscribe, don't follow, I don't really particularly care. Make up your own mind, especially if you love science. The reason I say that is because science, in my experience over the past 25 years that I've been doing this work, has become extremely territorial and elitist. Not only do they not go out there to search for new ideas, they believe their ideas are the only one that count and everybody else must be an idiot. Even when you put it on a plate for them, they are completely shut to it. They become even worse than a religious organization, if you like. They firmly believe that the only truth that matters is their truth. But as per Socrates, the unexamined life is not a human life. This is normally translated as meaning the unexamined life is not is not worth living, which is not what it means at all. It just, because that has no meaning. In this context, it means that the unexamined life is the life of an animal. In other words, if we do not question our motives and our beliefs, then we are just living like animals. We're not humans. That, as far as Socrates is concerned, there is a distinction between a human and an animal, and that is almost entirely in that one questions their motives and their actions before they commit to them. Therefore, by the same definition, unexamined truths are just opinions. They're like hemorrhoids. Every asshole has them. They mean nothing. If you do not have a logical path and an algorithm for your beliefs, then there's nothing. And more importantly, if we do not challenge establishment, then they become cults. And that's not science, and that's not education. Anyway, thanks.